Our next speaker for today is Dr. Mark Hoffmann. He's from North Carolina State University in the Department of Horticulture. He's assistant professor and small fruits extension specialist. His program is mainly focusing on production systems of strawberry and grape, and he will be talking today on training and pruning in muscadine grape. Take it away, Dr. Hoffmann.
Thank you. I will. Let me share my screen. Patrick, can you stop sharing the screen?
Let me. Okay.
Okay, thanks. All right, can you all see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Mark Hoffmann. I am the Small Fruits Extension Specialist here at NC State University. And I work a lot with the muscadine industry here. And before we start, I would like to echo what Patrick said in terms of cultivar choice. The muscadine industry, especially in Georgia and in North Carolina, has developed a lot over the last couple of 10, 15 years here, mainly driven by the releases of several breeding programs of cultivars which are more suitable for fresh market than the, I would say, older cultivars are. And that has really driven the fresh market industry here quite a bit. Still, the largest acreages is grown here in North Carolina are juicing cultivars, and then there is one prominent cultivar, which is Carlos, which Patrick introduced here. That's probably 80% of the acreage we have here in North Carolina still is our Carlos plantings, commercial acreage. But again, we do not recommend those. There are a couple of juicing cultivars which are common here. Carlos and Noble are the biggest ones. We do not recommend those as fresh market cultivars. So if you're thinking of starting a vineyard, or if you're thinking of getting into the business, you really have to make a decision. What do you want to do? Do you want to go into the fresh market realm, or do you want to go into the juicing or processing realm? Because that really decides what kind of cultivars you're gonna grow. And that was different a couple of years ago here in North Carolina, where Carlos was also sold as fresh market cultivar. But again, there are much better cultivars out there. So we are going to talk today about pruning and training of muscadines virtually. So that's always fun. So I hope I made a good presentation, and I will try to show you as good as I can on the screen how to prune a muscadine vine. We have three sections here. The major of the talk, the time we will spend with pruning mature muscadines. I'm going to demonstrate that on a very vigorous, probably the most vigorous grape we have, which is Carlos, which is again also the largest acreage here. And then I will go over general training tips. So if you start a muscadine, how do you train it? And then also we'll go over the first 2 years, just very briefly, because we only have like 25-30 minutes. Generally, I would recommend you, if you have a pruning workshop going on over COVID somewhere, try to socially distance, try to wear a mask, but go to the pruning workshop and attend the pruning workshop. There's a lot of value in getting hands-on practice in pruning a muscadine. It is really hard to demonstrate on the screen. We're going to try it nevertheless. So this is a picture of a pruned Carlos muscadine. It's in a mature vineyard. That vineyard had a lot of problems. We saw a lot of dead wood there. And often the limiting factor for especially for processing cultivars, if you have a mature vineyard, if the vines get older, is the amount of labor and amount of time you have. In this particular vineyard, for example, we had about 35 acres of vineyard which had to be pruned, but only 3 people who were able to prune. And that did lead to a lot of problems in that vineyard because not everything could get pruned at the same time. And there, we're going to talk a little bit about mechanical pruning too. I know there's a lot of that is done in larger acreage vineyards here in North Carolina and also in Georgia, but we're going to focus the most of the time on hand pruning. So I would say this is not a perfectly pruned Carlos muscadine, but you can see what the problems are already. For example, in this area here, you have like a whole chunk of your cordon which does not have any shoot growth. So you're going to have to leave more growth on this in this area. So we're going to go over this step by step and basically go from a situation which you have like here, where you have an unpruned older mature Carlos muscadine vineyard with a lot of like large antlers and a lot of dead wood, to like a situation where you have an area of a muscadine vine which is pruned to a certain number of buds per foot of corn. So, but first I would like to go over a couple of points. Why is it important to prune, and why is it important to do it yearly? And we're going to go over those. And then what are the pruning options and what tools are recommended? And then we go at one example over the pruning of a muscadine vine. So first of all, I love to show this picture because that's shown from a backyard of a friend of mine, and he didn't prune his muscadine vine for I think 3 or 4 years. And you can see here that it has grown through an old car which was parked there. And there are a couple of other reasons why you want to keep your muscadine vine pruned. One, which I think is very important for Florida growers, is control of disease. A lot of the diseases which Patrick mentioned, which Philip will mention this afternoon, are capable of overwintering in the vineyard and dead tissue. So it is important to get this tissue out, and also to regulate your yield, especially in overbearing cultivars such as Supreme. Pruning strategies are very important to implement. And then, of course, last but not least, you want to have access to your vineyard, and pruning also makes sure that you can access your vineyard over next year. So diseases, there are a couple of diseases which can overwinter. Black rot is probably the largest one. Trunk diseases, and you can see here a picture of a muscadine vine where a lot of the dead wood, you see here this wood was already dead in the winter, was not pruned out, and you can see that you lost yield and you have a lot of disease going on in this vineyard. So that could have been avoided with a correct pruning strategy. And there are many other diseases which Philip is going to talk about, which can be minimized or mitigated through correct pruning strategies as well. So in terms of pruning options, we have 2 different options. For most of you, manual pruning is probably the way to go. If you have a larger acreage, especially for processing cultivars, mechanical pruning is definitely an option. You would still, even in the manual pruning, you would have to do a procedure which is called pre-prune to get better access to the actual pruning site. So you would still have to patch off some of the shoots before you start pruning. Mechanical pruning is done a lot on larger acreage. In processing cultivars, it saves a lot of time and it saves a lot of labor. However, you cannot control things like diseases as much with mechanical pruning as you could do with manual pruning. So what we usually recommend is for manual pruning, which is very labor intensive, but you have the best control of yield and disease, and we usually recommend that for fresh market cultivars. So if you are thinking of starting a fresh market business, or if you're in the fresh market business, we would recommend not to manual prune, but to not to mechanically prune, but manual prune every year. And we found that on a very well-trained person probably needs 10 to 15 minutes per vine. I would say an average person, even if you have a couple of years of experience, it probably takes you 20 to 30, rather 30 minutes for a mature vine on a 20-foot spacing. And again, that is often the limiting factor in winter on larger acreage farms, is basically the amount of labor you have. It's often the most labor-intensive piece of muscadine growing, at least here in North Carolina it is. Also often the most expensive piece of muscadine growing here in North Carolina. Mechanically is of course less labor intensive. You can manage a much larger acreage of vineyard in a with less people. However, You will not be able to control your yield and your disease that much with mechanical pruning. You always leave a lot of dead wood in your vines, and if you do it over several years, you tend to cut off more of the fresh wood than you would with manual pruning. So what we often recommend is to do it on a rotation, if possible, and we do not recommend it for fresh market growers. If it's avoidable, we recommend not to do it. And it's often used in large acreage. We have a lot of larger growers who are contract growers for Dublin Winery, with the largest muscadine winery at the East Coast. And for those, mechanical pruning is often the way to go, because those are all family operations with 60, 80, 100, 120 acres of muscadines. And they often only have 5 or 6 people to manage those. So again, but you will see more disease and you will not control your yield that well. And for fresh market on a larger acreage, that's not what we recommend to do. Processing cultivars, again, just to emphasize here, Carlos and Noble are the big ones. We have a couple of growers who also grow Doreen and Magnolia, but again, Carlos and Noble are the big workhorses. Pruning tools. There are a couple of pruning tools. I would heavily suggest to invest into good pruning tools. They might be a little bit more expensive, but they're really worth it. There are a couple of companies out there, I show them all on those pictures here, which produce very well and well-made pruning tools. Corona, Felco, and Vesco are the 3 big ones which came to my mind. And I'm gonna go over all of those pruning tools with you piece by piece. So the first piece is, of course, you need a pair of hand pruners, or better, several pairs of hand pruners. I recommend, because mature muscadines have very hard wood, to have 1 bypass pruner and 1 heavy duty hand pruner. Important is that they have replaceable parts and that they're reliable, and that they should not hurt your hand. Usually it costs around $40 to $70 per piece. The same is true for a pair of short bypass lobbers. Again, find those who have replaceable parts and where you can know where to get replaceable parts, and also those who are reliable. Again, they're a little bit more costly, but they're definitely worth it, especially if you're on a larger acreage. And with larger acreage, I mean everything which is more than an acre of muscadines will be a lot of pruning work for one person. Then heavy-duty lobbers are important, especially if you are having a mature muscadine vineyard. If you have to cut out some larger wood pieces, which might be infested by disease. Also, again, replaceable parts are very important. Long handles, they should have a large opening. And again, I would invest some money. And then, last but not least, saws, pruning saws are also important. Again, in more mature muscadine vineyards, if you have to cut out some of that wood. Very important tool. Again, if you find some who you can replace the blades, that would be the best option of choice. Other tools for larger acreage, if you want to continue, if you want to hand prune, are pneumatic and electrical pruners. They become more common in the industry. There are a couple of models out there. You often cannot reach everywhere with this, so you often have to come back with like a hand pruner and do the fine tuning, but you will get a lot of stuff done with an electrical pruner which will be faster and more efficient. So I recommend that for larger acres, especially for fresh market growers. Not everybody does that, but a few do, and they're very happy with that. Other things which you should remember if you prune are to have enough replacement blades for your pruning tools. You're going to need them. Have enough WD-40, some Lysol to clean your pruners at the end of the day. And also always wear gloves. And I always, in my pruning workshops, I always tell people, make sure that you know where your hands are, because those pruning tools are usually very sharp. And we had more than 1 injury in our pruning workshops. So, you make sure that you know where your hands are, especially if you prune with your hand pruners. So now, a muscadine wine muscadines are usually very vigorous. There are differences between the cultivars. We're going to go over a vigorous wine at the beginning, and this is just a picture to show you what we're talking about. So the area down here is usually referred to as trunk. Then you have a fruiting spur here, so we call that spurs, and then we call the large arm, we call that cordon. So a muscadine is usually a high wire bilateral training system. You see here you have like one high wire, and you have two cordons which go basically across those two wires, and that is how muscadine is trained. So before we go over training, we will go into the depths of pruning. So the first step is to look at your vine and assess the vigor of the vine. And a lot of people it's a little bit counterintuitive, but usually the more vigor your vine has, you want to keep more buds per foot of cordon. So you want to keep keep that vine more vigorous. If you have a less vigorous vine, you want to prune it a little bit more harsh than you have a more vigorous vine. So that's the first step. Look at the vine and assess the vigor of the vine. The second step, evaluate the structure of the vine. So look at, do you need to cut off old wood, or do you need to replace some of the spurs, or do you need to replace a whole cordon because it has a lot of dead areas on the cordon. So in this case, for example, you see here you have a lot of like really long spurs. That is happening if you always if you always prune at the same spur that extends the spur every year a little bit, and then you end up in a situation after a couple of years where you have like really long spurs. We call that anklers. They're not very favorable because you have a lot of dead wood basically in between those, and it's really hard to replace them. So we try to have a pruning strategy where you do not get to the ankler stage, where you want to keep your spurs close to the cordon. And again, if we talk about number of buds per foot of cordon, it really depends a little bit on the cultivar. If you have highly vigorous cultivars like Carlos or Noble, you can leave about 35 to 40 buds of foot per cordon. If you have a 20-foot cordon, that gets you to 700 to 800 buds per vine. While on other cultivars, which Patrick mentioned, especially Supreme, where you can be overcropping, the pruning strategy is much more important. And we usually don't crop a Supreme to more than 600 buds per vine. That translates into 25 to 30 buds per foot of cordon on a Supreme vine. A lot of that is anecdotal knowledge and not research backed. We have research on Carlos, but we do not have research in terms pruning research on Supreme or any other of the cultivars. What I also suggest is to pre-hedge before you go and prune a mature muscadine vineyard, and then avoid anklers and long spurs, as I said before, and stay close to the trunk if possible. Healthy wood, that's the wood which you want to keep, is pencil thick and brown. I have a picture put here. You also see here this is what we refer to as a bud. So often you find a bud down here at the base, which is the base bud. We do not count those base buds. We usually start counting the buds at the first node. So this is a node here. This is the internode. And then this is our first bud. So this is how we count buds. We want to keep as much healthy wood as possible. That's not always possible because it depends on how old the wine is and how affected by other diseases the wine is. Usually you want to have nodes which are about 2 inches apart, as you can see here on the picture. That would constitute to like a healthy wood, which would get you some nice growth the next year. So pre-hedging, you want to go from a situation like this with a hedger to a situation which is closer to this, where you already saw you have like hedged something off here and something off here, and then you only can go in and it makes it easier to prune by hand. So that is a practice which a lot of growers do here in North Carolina. It's highly recommended. It takes much more time if you don't pre-hedge to prune your wine than if you do pre-hedge your wine and then you come in and prune your wine. Again, mechanical pruning, you would be done by that point of time. But mechanical pruning again is not suitable to control diseases or to control growth as much as you would do with manual pruning. So now I try to put that, that's what I would usually demonstrate on a wine. So now we're trying to do it on the screen. So we usually look first, as I said, the first step is to look at the overall wine, look at the vigor, and then decide how much how much vigor the wine is and how much you're going to prune the wine according to the vigor. The second part is look at the wine and see if there are places which need to be replaced on the wine. So in our case, we have not that much vigor on the wine, mainly because I was lazy yesterday and didn't want to put too many stars on the screen. And then secondly, we do have areas in the wine, those are those black areas here, which do have dead wood and where you don't see a lot of growth. So while you look at the first foot of the cordon here, you see you have like 1, 2, 3, 4 spurs. On your second foot of cordon, you have a lot of dead wood, but you do not have a lot of spurs, and those spurs don't show a lot of growth. So you have an area with a lot of growth, and then you have an area which do not have a lot of growth. So your pruning decisions are based on that first assessment. And again, with more experience, you see that, and you're just going to start pruning. If you're new to pruning, then you're going to have to spend a little bit more time assessing the wine and to make the right decisions. So in our case, we would like to go to 25 buds per foot. On this particular wine, again, with a Carlos, you would go much higher. You would go probably 10 buds more than that, maybe even 15. For our experiment here, we're just going to do 25 buds per foot. So I don't want you to count all those like little stars. Every little star would basically is one bud, which we count. So usually if we have about 71 buds here on the first foot of cordon. So we have way too many buds than we would need on the first, while we only have 17 on the second foot of cordon. So still, we do not want to keep 71 buds at the wine. So in the first step, you would basically make cuts, and I explain every single of those cuts. You would make cuts which, according to the rules which we said, you want to keep close to the cordon. You want to reduce the number of buds to like a good amount of time number, and you do want to avoid crowding on the wine. So the first cut we made is basically the cut to take off this large angler here. You see, this is like a much larger spur than this one, and it has a lot of buds which you could cut off there, and it has like a really nice new growth directly from the base here, which you could use as a new spur. So we're going to cut off that angler. That eliminates a lot of buds already. And then the next thing is really only a little bit cosmetic. We have a long growth here. Often the buds at the end of those growths are not that valuable as at the beginning. So you would cut that off to 3 to 4 buds on that particular shoot. The same you would do down here, especially because you have another long one coming off here, and you don't want to have overcrowding here. So that is basically the first decision we made. So we get rid of those, and then we still have a long antler here, which comes off on the other side of the wine, which is very common on muscadines, that you have growth on both sides of the wine, and you often do want to have spurs which coming off on both sides rather than just spurs coming up on one side of the corn. So in this case, this is going to be a little bit more complicated. So again, we have a lot of buds here. We have a very long antler. We want to stay close to the cordon if possible. So we could get rid of this whole antler and just keep this growth and this growth going. And then The other consideration which you're going to have to make in this case is that you have a lot of dead wood here, and the question is if it's worth retaining this cordon and grow it one more year, or if you already have like a new long nice growth here, do you want to grow a new cordon and get rid of the old cordon? So those are the questions which you're going to have to ask yourself if you start pruning a muscadine. So in this case, I decided to get rid of most of that antler and keep those two shoots for fruit production. And then I also would use this one here to train a new cordon, since we have so much dead wood and low growth in the rest of the cordon. I would basically recommend to cut off that piece of cordon at least in the next year. So if you don't do it this year, what people often do is they train this piece, see how it goes, and if it develops into like a nice cordon over the year, you would cut off the other piece in the following winter. So latest in the following year, you would basically have a situation which would look like this. So in a pruning workshop, I would now tell everybody to take their tools and just start pruning and exercise. We cannot do that here, unfortunately, but I hope that showed you a little bit what kind of considerations you want to do if you prune a muscadine. Often what people do, often what's happening is that it's not pruned enough, which often leads to more vigor. And that is okay in some cultivars like Carlos and Noble. They're not as susceptible if you leave too many buds on them. But if you go into the fresh market realm, there are some cultivars which you want to prune in the correct way. Also for the pickers, it's easier to gain access if you have a good pruning strategy in your cultivars. Again, in this case, what I would do, that was pruned by the crew of the vineyard. But what I would do at least would be I would get rid. I would not have this. You see this large antler sticking out, and you have a lot of pretty good wood coming out on the other areas. So I would definitely get rid of this piece, and then from the pruning strategy, you have like this large dead piece here, so you would keep, that's why they kept some of this wood and some of this wood, and I assume that's also why they kept this piece, this antler, which comes out into this area. However, I would consider taking this off because you have a lot of growth coming off from the other side here. You can see that here, and you can see some here. So I would consider it's enough to fill that gap. So I would take this piece off as well. So that it is for pruning. I'm going to go into the Q&A and see on the questions before we start. I see there was a lot of popping up here. So you can see if they're. So by hedging, what I mean by hedging is you take a mechanical, either a hand hedger or a tractor mounted hedger, and you basically cut off part of the pruning of the wood in winter, so that you basically don't have to access the whole wood if you manually prune. You want to make it easier for your pruning crew to actually access the vine. That is what I mean with hedging. And then what time of the year or phase of growth is ideal of pruning? Of course, in dormancy, you prune during winter. You don't prune after bud break. You prune before bud break. So with muscadines, they often have a very short time of dormancy. And I think even especially in Florida, it's going to be tough. We usually start pruning as soon as it gets cold here, which is usually somewhere around December, and then we see bud break often. We often goes into like February here. So I would think in Florida that time frame is a little bit shorter, and you probably want to get your pruning done somewhere around January, definitely before bud break, if possible. So I hope that answers those questions. All right, and then do you recommend removal of most stems originating on the bottom of the cordon? Yes, we're gonna go talk over that in a second when we talk about training. All right, so our next piece is on training, and I focus here especially on the training of the first couple of years. But some general tips. When you plant plants, keep enough space so that the roots don't curl. That's very important. You have enough space if you plant your dormant plants. Planting occurs usually in spring. So we have growers who plant in fall, but usually please do plant your plants after the last frost. That's like a common rule here in North Carolina. Florida, that can be a little bit earlier, so that you give the plant enough time in the first year to develop a cordon on the trunk. So very important, your planting date is usually in spring. With muscadines, you can order, it depends on the size of your order, you can order relatively close to spring your plants if you only order a few. If you are on larger acreage, you want to get in your order about a year ahead of time and let the nursery know that this is your target planting date, so that they know when to ship the vines. Because once they're in your place, you either have to keep them cool for a certain amount of time until you plant them, or you're going to have to plant them right away, basically. So that's important. Pruning takes place during dormancy, before buds break, and planting takes place after the last frost. For the first 2 years, pinch off your flowers and fruit as much as you can. It depends a little bit on the vigor of the vine, but our goal for the first 2 years of training a vine is not to yield. Our goal is to have them develop a healthy trunk system and a healthy root system. And very important, try to train a straight trunk. You can do that by using a string, or I would recommend a metal stick or a bamboo stick. Bamboo stick sometimes depends again on the cultivar. If you have like a very vigorous cultivar like a Carlos, a bamboo stick probably might not do. And then in year one, you often see a lot of growth difference and bigger difference even in the same cultivar in year one. With those who do not show a lot of vigor, and they didn't come up all the way to both wires, or they didn't come up to both wires in a good structure, you can cut them back quite a bit and basically let them grow again in the second year. So that's kind of the strategy to establish a vineyard and to train vines. Again, I've made it here a little bit clearer. Usually we are on a single high wire system. We use here in North Carolina, we use a 12.5 gauge wire. The wires between 5.5 and 6 foot of height, and we have a bilateral training system. So we train basically on both sides of the vine, both sides of the trunk. Our cordons, both cordons, usually we are on a 20-foot spacing. So you have every 20 foot you have a vine. And usually also you have every 20 foot you have a post. So basically one post per vine. That is kind of the rule which we have in muscadines. The cordons, if they establish, can be later, if they're mature, they can be very heavy. So you're going to have to make sure that you do have a good supportive trellis system and good supportive end posts. That's very important. I do not recommend to use a drill to put the end posts in, because that can be very because they have to take a lot of weight. So I would use a post driver to put the posts in, just because it gives them more hold. I would also anchor the wire with a soil anchor at the end of the end posts. So all that can be done in the first year. If you plant your plant, and often it looks a little bit like this. If you have a little bit more vigorous plant, they show shoots also which come from the base. They show shoots from the beginning of the base, and they show shoots at the end. And you often have like 4 or 5 different shoots which grow up to the wire. And this here, the blue thing, that's your bamboo stick or your metal stick. So often at the end of the year 1, you have a situation like this. What you do is you cut off those 2 because you don't want to have them, and you leave it like this. So now you would think this is sufficient, and but there is a big problem at the end here. You have basically you have basically a shoot which comes off very close to the wire, so you're gonna and that often gives you problems later on when the wire starts to grow into the wood. You have a situation like this here, where you can see that basically from the trunk to the cordon there was not a lot of space between trunk and the wire, and you had to bend over that piece, and that led to like wounds later, and if the wood is growing, and that also increases the amount of disease you have in that vine and the amount of damage you get in that vine. And it's also very hard to get off the trellis system. So you do not want to have a situation like this. So as a rule of thumb, you usually want to cut this off and keep about 3 to 6 inches of distance between the wire and the split which you make to go over to the cordon. And now you have a very weak cordon on the other side. So in this situation, I would basically almost recommend at the end of year 1 to like cut it all the way back and let it grow again in year 2. And then you make the split. You can do the split both ways. If you don't have enough growth, you just make one. You only bend one of the cordons in year 2, and then you bend the next one in year 3. That's also possible. Again, that is only one possibility. If you have enough, if you have a situation like this in year 1, you can keep it like that and start growing in year 2. But often we recommend to cut it off at the year end and just have a new growth at the year 2 to establish a more healthier cordon and trunk system. Another, if you train your vine across the wire, make wide curls, don't curl it too narrow. Again, you will have the same problem that the wire will grow into the wood at some point, and that's going to be just a recipe for more disease. And also you want to keep a distance of the split between 4 to 6 inches to the wire if possible. That makes it much easier to train a vine as well. Then more information on muscadines. We have a bunch of webinars up on our homepage, and we have also a portal where you can find updates on our muscadine news. And then with Patrick and Philip, who are on the call today, and several other people, we also developed a new muscadine production guide. You will find a lot of information in there as well. It's available on our homepage and also on the Small Fruits Consortium homepage. And with that, I take questions if there are any questions.
Thank you. I know there was one question for Dr. Hoffmann in the Q&A box.
Do you want me to answer that question quick?
Yes, if you want, sure.
Sure. If you have a situation like this where you have a trunk which is already around the wire, and you want to get rid of this, so what I would do is I would start looking for spurs that are suitable as a trunk replacement, and just keep those for this year, but do not cut off the trunk, and see if they are suitable for a new cordon. And then you cut off basically that old piece of cordon, and you will not be able to get that off the wire. You will probably still hang on the wire, because that's really hard to get off. And that is the strategy what I would do. So I would not go ahead and cut a cordon if it's around the wire. I would first start looking for a good spur which you could use as a new, or a good shoot which you could use as a new replacement for the cordon. And then do that next year if you see that this shoot works.